next paper is by Joseph Rodrigues.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes. And that will be Lessons from the Tombs, a Pragmatic Analysis of the Asceticism of St. Antony the Great, a 12-step program. Joseph is a Christian of the Orthodox tradition and a researcher of the 12-step program. His area of interest is in the relationship between the ascetic practices of the Eastern Orthodox Church and the 12-step model for recovery from alcoholism and addiction. He implements his research in a practical sense by facilitating a meeting of the St. Anastasia's Fellowship at his home parish and ministering to the Orthodox Christians in San Quentin State Prison. Thanks, Joseph, for being here.
Yeah.
Take it away.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much. It's such an honor to be here, and I wanted to first thank Dr. Randa Anderson for convincing me to submit my paper, and to the Orthodox Christian Association of Medicine, Psychology, and Religion. I also would like to thank, because this is being recorded, I want them to hear this, for Angie and Steve Grita, because without their support and donation, I wouldn't have been able to bring my wife along with me to this beautiful opportunity. And I'm sure I've shared this with many of you here. When I produced the book that I'm going to be reading a little bit of today, she read the whole thing out loud in one sitting while I edited it. Wow. So this is why I'm here today, as you can understand. Right. So the work that I'm going to be presenting today is more of a selection from the unpublished book entitled Lessons from the Tombs, St. Antony the Great and the 12-Step Program. While any discussion of the ascetic practices of the Desert Fathers is a riveting and exciting one, as we can all imagine, the purpose of my talk today specifically is essentially to give you a look at the first chapter of my work entitled The First Surrender. And I just had my phone. I wanted to read you. There we go. I thought it would make more sense to read the abstract from my book so that it puts it into context, because we do have a little bit of time. So, Lessons from the Tombs. The ascetic disciplines of St. Antony the Great and the 12-step program. Why would someone who has found sobriety through the spiritually inclusive 12-step program, who has recovered from a hopeless state of mind and body by means of surrender to a self-defined higher power, ever be compelled to turn to Jesus Christ? The present thesis attempts to answer this question by first demonstrating how the disciplines of the 12-step program are a living embodiment of the disciplines of St. Antony the Great, the father of desert asceticism. This is shown by an analysis of their common practices and beliefs, beginning with the surrender to a higher power, followed by imitation, labor, self-examination, and daily effort. With the major discrepancy between the two ascetic models being their relationship with Jesus Christ, this book then argues that the self-defined higher power of the 12-step program, which developed out of William James's pragmatic philosophical position that truth is found in its practical consequences, reveals itself to be insufficient on its own terms, as it fails to provide the long-term flourishing that the 12-step program itself envisions. By way of the pragmatic method, this book then demonstrates that as a means for obtaining long-term flourishing, the 12-step program innately proposes the need for a relationship with God, providing the answer to its principal question. If one is open to a relationship with God, he will reveal himself as Jesus Christ. It is here where this book returns to St. Antony the Great, as he provides the active member of the 12-step program with a model for the already familiar ascetic disciplines to reach their perfection in the reliance upon God as Jesus Christ. So putting a little context of what it is I'm about to read. So the intended audience of this work is split into two groups. One is those of the Apostolic Church, Orthodox Christians who may find interesting the fact that the ascetic life of the early church is striving in contemporary times, although for some in an unexpected location, the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous. As one clergy member confided to a visitor of his parish, there is more spirituality in this building on Tuesday evenings in the basement than on Sunday mornings in the sanctuary. Now, this is not to open the door to a critique of the life of the contemporary church, specifically that of the West, but it is more of an unavoidable reality. A spiritual life akin to that of the Orthodox Christian is found in the daily life of the member of the 12-step program, and more specifically with respect to my research, the member of Alcoholics Anonymous. The other group, my primary intended audience, is the member of the 12-step program, the alcoholic or addict who is called to something deeper. This brings us to the proposed question of my work. As I already read, I'll read it again. Why would someone who has found sobriety through the spiritually inclusive 12-step program, who has recovered from a hopeless state of mind and body by means of surrender to a self-defined higher power, ever be compelled to turn to Jesus Christ? In order for us to make an approach at a satisfactory answer, reminding ourselves that we are all called to bear the light of Christ and His church, we must first look at the common practices and beliefs of both the alcoholic member of the 12-step program and the Orthodox Christian. What better example of an Orthodox life lived in the contexts of Christ's revelation, self-sacrifice, and resurrection than the father of desert asceticism, Antony the Great? We as Orthodox Christians are all familiar with the story. A 3rd century Egyptian-born man grew up in a life devoted to comfort. His whole desire was, as it is written, to live at home, unaffected by the outside world. This dedication to the safe existence of his known world spurred his decision to withdraw from school, wishing to stand apart from the normal activities of children. Although neither a problem child nor an ingrate who hungered for a more lavish existence, Antony was simply content with the privileged life he has received from his parents, not interested in anything more than was already given to him. As Athanasius writes, having Christian parents, Antony was brought up as a Christian, and although a homebody, would join his parents in church. This was not solely an empty household regulation, for Antony was attentive as a listener to Scripture, keeping in his mind the heart what was profitable from them. The death of his parents brought new responsibility to the young man around 18 to 20 years old, the care for a home and for a young sister. His comfortable life was now challenged with real-world decisions. Remaining a devout Christian, Antony was on his way to church when he reflected upon the charity for the poor and the Acts of the Apostles. The life to which Antony was accustomed up to this point met friction. The Christian life, represented in his contemplations on the way to church, had revealed a call beyond that with which Antony was comfortable. Upon arriving to church, Antony's contemplations were reinforced with the gospel read on that day. If you want to be perfect, go, sell all your possessions and give to the poor, and come follow me, and you will have treasure in heaven. Drawing the conclusion that this passage was addressed to him directly for his own sake, he followed the instructions which Christ gave the rich man. Athanasius writes, he immediately left the church, and the possessions that he had inherited from his ancestors he freely gave to people from his village so they would not bother him or his sister about anything. He sold all his remaining possessions and, collecting a considerable amount of money, distributed it among the poor, keeping a little for his sister. As William Harmless notes, the gospel reading had affected Antony deeply, for he saw himself in the reading. He was the rich young man to whom Jesus was speaking. Although content with his material life, the Christian life to which he was called was unattainable by familiar means. More was to be required from him if he wished to reach Christian perfection. Returning to church, he was given further gospel instruction. Do not be concerned about tomorrow. He was troubled by this instruction, finding unbearable the compromises he had made. So he left and distributed his remaining things among those less well off. His sister he entrusted to well-known and faithful virgins, while from that time on he devoted himself to ascetic discipline in front of his home. That which was once his source of happiness, his sheltered home life, was now the stumbling block he was to reject, embracing the contrary life of the wilderness protisikias, as it says in the Greek. The alternative for Antony, to continue living the way he was living in the comfort of his home, was no longer an option. When reading the origins of Antony, one must be wary of the tendency to see his rejection of material goods and the embrace of an ascetic life as unrelatable. divorced from contemporary life. It is easy to view such drastic measures as Antony felt called to take as unnecessary, even alien to a person whose life couldn't be anything further removed than that of a young and wealthy 3rd century Egyptian man. Setting aside the seemingly foreign external characteristics of Antony's origins, one appreciates the young man's internal conflict, the tension between the comfortable living of his earthly life and the call to Christian perfection, a perfection to which all Christians, including himself, are called. It became clear to Antony during his contemplation on the Acts of the Apostles that he would not be able to obtain salvation if he were continuing down this path. What Antony came to know was that congenial living and a love for Christ were two opposing principles. While Athanasius reports that Antony acted immediately upon hearing the first gospel reading, Dervis Chidi presents an interesting perspective on Antony's behavior. He quotes, "Obeying this, the initial call of Matthew 19:20, but keeping a little money for the sale to provide for his sister, he heard once more the gospel, 'Take no thought for the morrow.' His attempt to safeguard control of his life created this unbearable tension. Responding to the gospel, Antony approached what we call the jumping off point of self-abandonment and an actualized and all-encompassing reliance upon God with respect to both the material and eternal dimensions. No longer was he to see his material possessions of any value, leaving himself from earthly comfort and toward harsh living, solely dependent upon God's grace, both moves which were, up to this point, institutionally foreign to Antony on a practical level. The abandonment of self and of old ways of living in place of the embrace of the care and protection of God is all too familiar for the hopeless alcoholic who has considered the 12-step program as a viable way of living. Just as Antony's withdrawal from his previous life was neither irrational nor precautionary, but vital and necessary, the recovery for the alcoholic begins with considering the unbearable state in which he finds himself as inescapable and beyond human aid. The gift of salvation from alcoholism is rooted in this desperation and defeat. One, of course, must first be open to the notion that he has, in fact, been defeated. This is the first step of the 12-step program. We admitted we are powerless over alcohol, that our lives had become unmanageable. As Dr. William D. Silkworth writes in his first letter to the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous, men and women drink essentially because they like the effect produced by alcohol. Okay? Dave B., author of one of the stories in the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous entitled Gratitude in Action, confirms Dr. Silkworth's explanation. Quote, "I became an active alcoholic from that first day, the day of my first drunk, when alcohol produced a very special effect in me. I was transformed. Alcohol suddenly made me into what I had always wanted to be." End quote. The power produced in the alcoholic once having taken a first drink is that of a supreme source of comfort. As if unaware he had been holding his breath his entire life, the alcoholic feels that he is able finally to breathe for the first time. It is a power beyond his own. When embraced, the disease of alcoholism embeds into the alcoholic's entire being, affecting both his physical and mental condition. Dr. Silkworth writes, "The sensation caused by alcohol is so elusive that while they admit it is injurious, they cannot after a time differentiate the truth from the false." Similar to Antony's embrace of comfort constituting the barrier of his salvific journey, Bill Wilson, co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, included his reflection of the illusory power of alcohol. Quote, "I commenced to forge the weapon that one day would turn in its flight like a boomerang and all but cut me to ribbons." End quote. What had once been considered a false god revealed to purely be false. Nothing about this admittance is easy, nor is it something to be admired as the book, The 12 Steps and 12 Traditions, acknowledges in its reflection on the first step. Who cares to admit complete defeat? Practically no one, of course. In the chapter more about alcoholism, the admittance of powerlessness is expressed as anything but welcomed. Quote, "Most of us have been unwilling to admit that we were real alcoholics. No person likes to think that he is bodily and mentally different from his fellows. Upon the discovery of their dilemma, alcoholics will try to prove to themselves exceptions to the rule, and therefore not alcoholic. The experimentation of recapturing that sense of power and control yields a myriad of self-imposed tests: drinking beer only, limiting the number of drinks, never drinking alone, never drinking in the morning, drinking only at home, etc. The disastrous lengths to which an alcoholic is capable of going without admitting defeat does not take much imagination. Looking long enough into our own families and parishes at the sad tales of wasted potential and unnecessary suffering will surely emerge. It must be noted that, similar to the difficulty in relating to Antony's situation in 3rd century Egypt, desperation, as is made clear in the 12-step program, comes in a variety of shapes and sizes. The Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous, as affectionately called, discusses those individuals who had not gone to the same extreme lengths that others had gone to before seeking help from the 12-step program. Quote, "Most of these fortunate ones have had little or no acquaintance with delirium, with hospitals, asylums, and jails. Some were drinking heavily, and there had been occasional serious episodes. But with many, drinking had been a little more than a sometimes uncontrollable nuisance. Seldom had any of these lost their health, business, family, or friends." End quote. Those who approach the first step with openness and honesty have the same thing in common. Each individual had come to believe in a hopelessness and futility of life as they had been living it. As for Anthony, his defeat began with the contemplation of the Acts of the Apostles and the hope for the eternal salvation waiting for those willing to surrender. Where Anthony would turn was obvious. Arriving to church, Anthony heard his instruction. Father Matthew the Poor illuminates Anthony's temperament as it relates to his surrender. Quote, "Obedience to the commandment as understood from the life of St. Anthony, and as he himself realized, is based on the understanding that it is a divine instruction. St. Anthony brought himself and his entire life to a complete halt for the sake of obeying the Lord's statutes." End quote. The love for Christ he received as a youth and the openness to Scripture gave Anthony the direction required for salvation. He was to abandon himself in the embrace of a power that would provide him that which he would not be capable of achieving on his own terms. The alcoholic's response to powerlessness and unmanageability, having had to fully concede to his innermost self that he was an alcoholic, although not as defined as Anthony's, finds itself pointing in the same direction: God. The chapter written to those of an agnostic temperament in the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous provides a final test for the individual unsure of the nature of their drinking behavior, stating, "If, when you honestly want to, you find you cannot quit entirely, or if when drinking you have little control over the amount you take, you're probably an alcoholic." As the description of the alcoholic up to this point has been defined, the curious reader, if of the alcoholic kind, will be left feeling uneasy, as Dr. Silkworth provides his experienced medical opinion that most chronic alcoholics are doomed. I think those in the medical profession here can have probably seen that more often than not. Having surrendered to the fact that they are bodily and mentally unsound, the 12-step program presents its suggested solution by declaring, if that be the case, that you are an alcoholic, you may be suffering from an illness which only a spiritual experience will conquer. Now, the term spiritual experience may be defined in a broad manner, stated in the second appendix of the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous, as they say, the personality a change sufficient to bring about recovery from alcoholism. It further describes this change as being dependent fundamentally on an awareness of a power greater than themselves, or what their more religious members call God consciousness. What experience had taught these alcoholics was that, left to their own devices, the life they had been living would eventually come to a traumatic end. Up to this point, they were on borrowed time. With their problem rooted in a lack of power, the solution would require a new power source. Quote, "We had to find a power by which we could live, and it had to be a power greater than ourselves." End quote. Although the initial consideration of a power greater than that willfully produced in the alcoholic may not be a favorable one, faced with alcoholic destruction, they stated, we soon became as open-minded on spiritual matters as we had tried to be on other questions. In this respect, alcohol was a great persuader. It finally beat us into a state of reasonableness. Having been persuaded, the alcoholic reaches step 2. Came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. Antony's faith in the redemption of his soul had already been firmly planted by hearing Christ's gospel from his childhood. For the alcoholic, this reality cannot be assumed. Once, however, he embraces the fact that reliance upon something bigger than him is the only solution to the disease of alcoholism, he is able to see that recovery is in fact possible, as stated in the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous' 3 pertinent ideas. A, that we were alcoholics and could not manage our own lives. B, that probably no human power could have relieved our alcoholism. And C, that God could and would if he were sought. Being convinced, as Alcoholics Anonymous states, we were at step 3, which is that we decided to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood him. This decision is not a thought process, but an actualized change in perception. The alcoholic asks himself, what would my life look like if I were to abandon myself to God as I understood him? For Antony, the answer to this question was given in the scripture reading as he entered church. If you want to be perfect, go sell all your possessions and give to the poor, and come follow me, and you will have treasure in heaven. For the alcoholic, the answer is of the same severity, as the popular adage in the 12-step program states. There is only one thing you have to change, and that one thing is everything. This decision may be the simple effort in attending a 12-step meeting and stating one's name and disease. My name is, and I am an alcoholic. For others, the initial decision may be an entire upheaval of the alcoholic's life. It may be appropriate in some cases to seek medical attention. In either case, the alcoholic has made a decision to quit playing God, to admit that he no longer has a viable plan for living a sustainable life and is willing to consider any option not of his own design. The response to the call of Christian perfection in Antony was conducted with the same severity as that of the alcoholic's call to sobriety. It is this drastic measure which the alcoholic is willing to undergo in order to save his life and recover from alcoholism that truly embodies the severity of Antony's exercise, the severity Antony exercised in order to save his soul. The call to Christian perfection for Antony was quite literally a matter of life and death. Fortunately for the alcoholic, he is well acquainted with matters such as these, and is prepared to go to any lengths for salvation. As clearly demonstrated, however, the alcoholic was unable to manage his own life by himself, on his own terms. Trust in a higher power and guidance became indispensable building blocks for recovery. As for Antony, his guidance came in the form of an elder outside his village. To be continued.
Thank you. I look forward to hearing the rest or reading the rest of it. Even from the title of your forthcoming work, Lessons from the Tombs, there's the obvious reference there to death,
yep.
Right? And I don't think it's a coincidence that Antony's conversion, his experience in the church, in the liturgy of hearing the word and taking it to heart, happens shortly after his parents die, right? So I'm wondering if do you reflect in your work at all on the significance of mindfulness of death or experience of death as a spiritual practice that kind of begins this renewal process?
A whole chapter.
Okay.
Yep. Daily death, as it is called. That the alcoholic living on a daily basis acknowledges, and by the way, I use he because the Big Book of Alcoholics was written in 1939, and that was the demographic. Obviously, men and women both suffer from alcoholism, but the alcoholic, on a daily basis, it's suggested of him to remind himself that when he says he is an alcoholic, what that means is you're going to drink again.
Yeah, I mean, if I could just add one follow-up on that. I mean, I think from an broader Orthodox spiritual perspective, at one point you said the alcoholic, realizes that he's on borrowed time.
Yep.
Well, aren't we all?
Well, you're bringing up, I think, my subliminal point to everyone reading this.
Yes.
You are. We all are.
Right, when it says, the alcoholic says, I'm not like my other man, right? I've always loved like AA meetings because they actually realize they're human, right? Like, they really do.
Yeah.
Like, I'm a human.
Yeah.
My name is Seth, and I'm a human, right? Like,
Joseph, thank you. Wonderfully done. I wrote a whole bunch of stuff down here, but I don't even know where to begin. I don't know if this means anything to you. It's spot on. All right. I'm a former New York heavyweight wrestling champion. I won the state championships with 8 seconds left. So when the first step says in the 12 and 12, who cares to admit complete defeat? That was not in my vocabulary.
Yeah.
Get alcohol and drugs kick my ass. And so I know what could beat me. And it is the darkness, it is the devil, it is the disease, all of the above. Right? And so the answer to everything is surrender. I didn't know that when I was a young man. But every time I surrender to self, I let go and let God, I win. I always associated surrender with losing. But it's not. It's actually, sort of an oxymoron. It's the opposite. And then this whole understanding that, we're in this world, but we're not of this world.
Yeah.
And the juxtaposition between monasticism and recovery. So I think it was Father Maximus who, after he went to Maximus Constans, after he went to Mount Athos, he came back and he wrote an essay on the role of a spiritual father, because it seemed like it was this surrender to the will of his spiritual father, knowing that this man will lead him to salvation. That was the deciding factor of him choosing monasticism, leaving a almost tenured Harvard professorship and all of that. I don't know if it was, so his parents were members of my church. He literally came and brought his parents to me, and he said, Father Dimitri, these are my parents. I'm going to Mount Athos. Take care of them for me. Which is just so humbling. And I was his TA when I was at the seminary. And so, in the same way, we surrender to the program, and we find another model in our sponsor. And there's a lot of discussion between the difference between the sponsor and spiritual father. There's got to be a distinction. But for people who've never had spiritual counsel, it's the next best thing. It's the first step. Let's call it that, right? It's the first step to finding sort of a direction by which to live, and hopefully according to spiritual principles. Right?
Amen.
So the fact that you, again, just suppose monasticism, St. Antony with recovery, I think I see all of this panning out, and I'm looking forward to reading the rest of the book, because this whole understanding of spiritual awakening. By the way, what is spiritual awakening?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Does it have to? So for me, it was simply when I identified as a spiritual being instead of just a human being. That is my awakening. Mm-hmm. Because if I identify as a spiritual being, I cannot treat you the way that I did before. because so are you. And so my whole paradigm, there's a huge paradigm shift in the way that I live after that. And so we live according to spiritual principles, which the 12 steps give us. Anyway, I feel like I'm preaching about it. I'll talk about it later.
Thank you. Thank you, Father.
So just first of all, fantastic. Very much looking forward to reading the rest. I'm curious if you touched upon St. Anthony's experience with that intense and deep struggle while he was in the desert and the demons and everything kind of piling in on him when he was at his lowest at that point, and how that relates to the process of recovering from alcoholism.
I don't, because I tend to find that the devil's pretty unoriginal, and we can all picture what that looks like. It's just I'm not interested. A lot of people are. It was cool readings, like spooky at night, reading. I'm just not quite interested in the dissecting the demonic attack as much as an alcoholic in the recovery. In the research that I've done, knows about. They know what that is. And it may not look like that the way Athanasius depicted, but they sure know what that is. So
They've lived it.
They've lived it.
Remember the definition of spirituality and religion in the roots, right? The people in AA say religion is for people who are scared to go to hell. Spirituality is for people who've already been there. Which is not a good definition. Nevertheless, it really does shine a light on the hell that they've lived, right?
Yeah. I'll give you just a quick example. This is why I don't talk about it. I knew an individual. He was in the 12-step program, and we had gotten into contact, and he needed some help, and he had just relapsed. He was an alcoholic, relapsed on crack cocaine. To give it the mind of an alcoholic to think, wow, I haven't had a drink, but I'll smoke some rock. Okay. And I remember he was crying, and he asked for help. And I agreed to do whatever I could at the time to help him. And in a second, all of a sudden, his face changed, and he's like, I'm straight. I think I'm okay. 3 days later, he hung himself. So I don't quite find the interest really in dissecting that topic. I know people do, but to me it's more of the redemptive nature. That's where the true, as my spiritual father says, the creativity of the demons is very outplayed. It's the creativity of love and that direction to theosis that's actually worth the discussion. So I hope that answers the question. Yeah.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah.